So welcome to episode 7 of Talking About Our Generation, the weekly look back at the glamorous history of rock and pop. My name's Gary McVeigh-Kane. I'm joined as always by my partner in pop,
Simon Warner. Gary, yeah, how are you?
I'm not too bad, Simon. Yeah, I've been pondering something over the last few weeks, and it's this, and it's quite an interesting question to pose to you. We all have music, like me. You're always looking for new music, but there's always music that from the past that you always kind of go to that you really like. But is there any kind of band or music that you go to that's your real, you're feeling a bit low, you've had a bit of a rubbish day, you just fancy listening to something that's really comfortable, you really like it, nice glass of wine, just sit and chill out, something that you always go back to? Is there anything like that for you, Simon?
I think there is. I mean, I was watching that Laurel Canyon documentary on the TV at the weekend. I don't know whether you caught sight of that, but I really do go back to that LA scene of the late 60s, early 70s. I love the Crosby, Stills and Nash period, Joni Mitchell. I still go back to those things, even though, they're just part of a 50-year-old past. But yeah, those are the bands I probably turn to. What about you?
It's Prefab Sprout.
Well, I have to say, Prefab Sprout are definitely one of my favourite bands.
Yeah, now, I don't, on a day-to-day basis, I don't play Prefab Sprout, but it's kind of the comfort blanket. If I've had a bit of a rubbish day, I'm going out for a walk and it's a bit miserable, I get it on my headphones, and those first 2 albums in particular, Swoon and Steve McQueen, they're just the thing that I go to all the time if I'm just having a rubbish time, and it is the comfort blanket.
Well, I have to say, Paddy McAloon, and I think our guest later on might agree with this, Paddy McAloon is one of the finest songwriters of the 80s, isn't he? He's wonderful.
He is, and I'm on Facebook. I'm on a Prefab Sprout appreciation group forum thing, and somebody put a question on today and said, "Have you listened to any of the lyrics from Prefab Sprout, and have they given you any guidance in life?" And I thought about that for about 30 seconds. I was waking up with my cup of tea this morning, and I posted a bit cheaply in a way, but I said, "Yeah, there's 2 lyrics that stand out. One is." Life's not complete till your heart skipped a beat. And the second one is when love breaks down, you join the Rets who leave their lives for easy sex. And I said, they've put me in good stead all my life, those 2. So.
They've been your guiding principles.
They have. The first one more than the second one, I've got to say.
Okay.
Anyway, I think it's time to introduce our guest for today. What do you say, Simon?
Absolutely right. Let's go for it, Gary.
Okay, well, the word polymath is thrown around quite often, but I think we've got a genuine polymath today, a man who's been a school teacher, head teacher no less, gone into musical writing music, kind of helping bands formulate their style and progress themselves along. He's a poet, he's been a journalist, and an all-round good guy. So Heath, welcome to Talk About Our Generation.
Thanks ever so much for the welcome. I've got a name drop for you straight away. Are you ready for a name drop?
Give us a name drop.
I used to interview Paddy McAloon a lot, and some of my interviews are on that Prefab Sprout website that you're talking about. So
fantastic.
If you type in one of my pseudonyms, as Simon knows, I've got millions of pseudonyms, Billy Smith, you'll see quite a few of my articles come up on that website. And the reason I am facetiously name dropping is I have to tell you, Gary, that Paddy is one of the greatest people I've ever met. Seriously, as a practicing Catholic, which is what I am, Paddy is one of the few people who can talk to me about that. At one time, he was hoping to become a priest, and he can talk about it without any embarrassment or any, silliness, for want of a better word. So whilst you've raised the word of Paddy McAloon and his huge talent, I will tell you, in all seriousness, he's one of the greatest people I've ever met, God bless him. But he's not so well at the moment.
Exactly. He's been going through some bad times, hasn't he, in the last 3 or 4 years?
Health-wise.
His hearing has gone, hasn't it? Hasn't his hearing failed?
Well, there's a number of things. Everything I've just told you is fact. From here on in, I'm just telling you what I'm hearing.
Yes.
And what I'm hearing on the grapevine is that he spends a lot of time alone in his studio. And of course, when you spend long periods of time alone, you kind of, I won't use the verb lose, you don't lose a lot of your faculties, but you know, things aren't what they were, let's put it that way. That's what I'm hearing. You know, he's grown this huge beard, as you probably know. He's very much the eccentric nowadays. So he may well be losing his hearing, Simon. And if he is, that's a dreadful, dreadful thing to happen to a man like that.
It is, but it's fascinating that all of us have got a soft spot for Paddy McAloon. And Gary was just saying, what's your go-to music if you're feeling as if you need a comfort blanket? Is there anything that you'd say you turn to?
Oh, definitely. I can answer that straight away. I thought of the answer when I was listening to Gary reply to you. It's The Fall. In the, you know, I mean, I hate to bring this up on your respectable program, but you know that feeling you used to get as a kid when you squeezed the spot? That's the feeling that The Fall generate in me. Because if you've had a dreadful day and you want to take it out on yourself, the appalling day you've had, then put The Fall on, because it's like sandpaper running across your cheek, isn't it? You know, once he sets off, that's it. So in answer to your question, Simon, The Fall every time.
Was there ever a particular period of The Fall that you really preferred more than any others, Heath? Or was it
Hex Induction, the album Hex Induction? And at that time, professionally, I was in a teaching post. I've always gone to tough schools because that's where my heart is. It's no good going into teaching and, you know, just dealing with easy situations. I think if your heart is in socialism, if your heart's in teaching, then you go where things are going to be tough. And at that particular stage, when Hex Induction was released, I'm talking about, I think it was 82, goodness me, I was at a tough place. So you'd come home, and instead of moaning to your missus or some mates in the pub, that's no good to anybody, I'd play Hex Induction Hour. And ironically, Gary, it was at that stage that Marquis Smith, you know, the singer with The Fall, invited me to go on tour with him as well. So it was a double dose. I'd play the album when I got home, and if I wasn't playing the album, I'd be on tour with him. And sometimes that was an even better feeling in terms of an abrasive ridding of the pain. Great times they were, Gary. Yes. But I also wrote a poem. I wrote some words about a night that Mark Smith and I spent at the Hacienda when we went to see William Burroughs. And when I used to support The Fall, I used to read it halfway through the set, halfway through it. You remember Ick, Sam? Do you remember Ick?
I do remember it, yeah.
Halfway through my band Ick's set, we'd have a lull where I'd read this poem about Marquis Smith on the night we went to the Hacienda to see William Burroughs. And one night we were at Teesside Poly. I didn't know, but he'd come out behind me. You know, I mean, this is most unlike him to do anything like that. But he came out and stood behind me without me knowing. And the audience, it was a sellout audience, Teesside Poly at Middlesbrough, went balmy. And I thought, chuffing heck, they like me poem. Wow, this is good. Yeah, now people are recognising my genius. And it wasn't till I looked round and there's him, you know, well, I don't know if it was flicking bees or what, it's something like that. So I went from feeling, yeah, I am the man, I am the new man here, to thinking, you prat, you prat.
That kind of sums up Marquis Smith, doesn't it? One experience, really.
Too damn right, yeah.
Well, today we're going to spend a little time thinking about the relationship between politics and popular music. And there are those cynics who believe the two things should never join hands and should never get together. There are others who see pop and rock and rap and other styles, particularly punk, for example, as platforms where people, you know, can really express their political feelings and connect with the wider public. And I know that you, Heath, are in the middle of working on a musical which celebrates the great Labour figurehead Keir Hardie. You might tell us something about that a bit later on. But you're obviously one of those people who feels as if popular music and politics can be in the same room. I mean, what is your feeling about the link between the two fields?
Well, as you just clearly intimated, Simon, I think that they are closely connected. And, you know, we can look at different periods. You've just spoken about the punk period, the one that preceded that, the countercultural period. If we look at those respectively, I won't look at loads of different periods, but let's look at the countercultural period and the way that politics, i.e. a new way of thinking, and music also being defined by that, i.e. a new way of thinking, led very much to defining the world in which we live in today. In that, I don't think, to be honest, that Silicon Valley and the whole information technology revolution would have taken place had it not been for the countercultural politics. They came essentially from the Whole Earth catalogue, if you remember.
Yes.
In the late 60s, you know, when you and I were kids, that Whole Earth catalogue was very much...
Stuart Brand, wasn't it? Stuart Brand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it inspired the information technology innovators to dream about the internet and the way in which the internet could be used for a common good and a common purpose, rather than how it might be hijacked in order to make money. I mean, what's really happened is that it's become a pure thing as the internet. I know that we've got problems with Facebook and Twitter periodically, but essentially it can still be used for the force of good. And so let me say that about countercultural politics, and let me talk also about the punk period, which effectively wiped the slate clean, for want of a better definition. And in doing that, shifted the emphasis from the moneyed, affluent middle classes, let's be facetious here, the Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, so to speak, with all the money to fund huge tours, and turn the spotlight to a situation where, without any musical skill and without any financial backing, you could move forward culturally and musically. And that's exactly what happened, you know.
Sure.
So many bands, I mean, I'd spent a lot of time working with the UK subs and many people who had been with the UK subs. And it always thrilled me as a former teacher that these young people who were in that band, I'm just citing the UK subs from very, very many, had been people who discovered their own worth and what perhaps they might be capable of in the future, because you didn't have to be affluent and moneyed. You could do it entirely by yourself, the DIY culture. So yeah, politics and music are definitely connected, and I love the way that they generate progress.
Do you feel, Gary, as if, I know you've always been politically minded, do you feel as if you've always seen that connection between your ideological feelings and the music maybe you listen to? Do you see a link there?
I think so, yeah. No, I think I've always taken interest in where the politics comes from and where it goes to in terms of music. So, I mean, I was born in 1970, so I was just too young to be. I was aware of punk when I was a 6-7 year old, but I was too young to be involved in it, kind of thing. A lot of my friends are a few years older than me, they were. But I have been heavily influenced by punk throughout my life. But what was interesting to me is when you start reading into the background of punk. And I think Grail Marx's book, Lipstick Traces, is absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant.
As an understanding of that. And what really fascinated me was that idea that whilst Joe Strummer was held up as the great political figure of punk, I always felt, I mean, I loved the Clash, they were my absolute favourite bands ever, but I always felt that John Lydon got the political side of what punk could do more than Joe Strummer ever did. Because I think Joe Lydon understood the concept of situationism. I don't think Paul Cook and Steve Jones did, in the Pistols, but I think John Lydon did get it. But I think the problem with John was that people saw him as this kind of genuine working class figure who couldn't possibly understand the politics behind it. It was just manipulated by Malcolm McLaren. But I always have a lot of respect for John Lydon, young John Lydon, because I think he really got situationism. He got the power of politics within that musical movement in a way that I think, I would argue, Joe Strummer perhaps didn't, because he came from traditionally a more comfortable background. I don't know what you think about that, either of you.
I've got something to say on that, if that's all right, Simon.
Yeah, please.
It's ironic, that Bradford had a very, very active punk scene. And there was a club, I think it's still there, the 1 in 12 club in Bradford. You know it, Gary?
I do, yeah. Been there many times, yeah.
Right, well, you might even remember, he's dead now, God rest his soul, a good mate of mine called Wild Willie Barrett. Remember Wild Willie Barrett?
Wild Willie Beckett.
Wild Willie Beckett, that was
Beckett,
it.
yes, yeah.
Now, you want to talk about a punk figure, there's your punk figure. But, he came out of Bradford, didn't he, with...
Psychosurgeons.
Yeah, Psycho.
Yeah.
I used to write about them for the Melody Maker.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant guy. However, he had New Model Army come out of Bradford with Jules and Justin and everybody. It was a really genuine punk movement. When you talk about Strummer being almost an image rather than a genuine, it was such a genuine punk movement in Bradford that achieved so much. Via, I have to say, in my opinion, I'm not saying I'm right, the 1 in 12 club, what a fantastic club that was. Gary, who used to run the place?
Yeah, Gary Cabinet, yeah.
Yeah. My wife used to be a head teacher, and she employed Gary to teach politics at Ryburn School.
Yeah.
And Gary was brilliant. Him and Stephen Wells. These were great times. But if we don't watch it, I'm going to be dominating your program. I don't want to do that.
No. So, you're the guest.
I just mentioned the 1 in 12 club.
But it's also worth mentioning, just down the road at the same time in Leeds, there was a fantastic political musical uprising with bands like the Gang of Four and the Mekons and the Three Johns. So, in fact, West Yorkshire at the time was really a bit of a hotbed of music plus politics, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I wonder whether there was that dissonance between Manchester and Leeds in terms of that end of punk. Punk emerged from London, then the Pistols toured, and everybody got into it in the regions. I always felt like bands like Joy Division and some of the Manchester bands, Buzzcocks, were less overtly political, whereas, as you said, Simon, the Leeds bands took on the politics a bit more, perhaps, than the Manchester bands.
Yes, in fact, to go back to Greil Marcus briefly, he referred a little posedly to Gang of Four as purveyors of neo-Marxist funk, which is an interesting mix of ideas. But the Gang of Four and their friends around 1980 were playing the bars and clubs of Leeds, and they were running into far-right activists, the National Front, and so on. It was quite a dangerous time to be making, leftist statements in the pubs of the city. So they were on the front line of something quite serious. And I guess also in perhaps a little less so in Manchester. I mean, I knew the Manchester scene better, but I can't remember such a heavy politicised scene. Can you, Heath, in Manchester? It was there weren't the same political figures, were there?
No, there weren't. And I was just reflecting then, Simon, a lot of the Leeds musicians that you're talking about from that period were students at Leeds Art School or Leeds University. They were essentially students who come into the city from outside. I mean, yes. Gang of Four, Delta 5, the Mekons, all those people were students in the city, whereas Manchester, I mean, Morrissey was a former pupil of the school where I was head teacher. And I knew the Stone Roses, people like that, from that Manchester scene to which you refer. None of them were university students or art school students. So they came from a completely different angle into everything. So although Leeds didn't enjoy the success that Manchester enjoyed, it was still an important city politically.
It was. And to go back to that interesting debate about Lydon versus Strummer, Gary, I mean, Joe Strummer at least did lead his politicised band into situations like the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism. And I rather felt if the Sex Pistols let themselves down somewhat by not attaching themselves to the really important political messages of the day. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I think so, yeah, and I think it was almost because, and I wonder whether that was the difference between Bernie Rhodes and Malcolm McLaren. That Malcolm McLaren, as the Svengali of the Pistols, sort of saw it more in the commercial sense, even though he came from a much more overtly political background than Bernie Rhodes. Whereas I think Bernie Rhodes saw the value of getting involved in movements like Rock Against Racism, and there was absolutely the right intent in Clash getting involved in those kind of movements. And of course, and then that springs on because Billy Bragg says, he was in Victoria Park that day of the Rock Against Racism gig and stood there as a guy who didn't really have politics and thought, I can do this. If I get a guitar, I can do this. And from that movement springs Billy Bragg, who takes it further. And in a sense, Billy Bragg was the guy, I suppose, in the 80s who began to make those links between saying, okay, we can be political musicians on the outside, or we can work with political parties, and particularly through Red Wedge, work with Labour Party. Billy took it that next step further, didn't he, where there was an involvement with an actual political party.
Did you, Heath, have any link to the Red Wedge scene? I mean, I went along to the gigs, but do you remember it as a time when you were associated with some of the artists who were supporting that venture?
I was on the Red Wedge tour.
You were on it?
Yeah, with the rhythm.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, so we did, I don't know, about 20 or 30 Red Wedge dates with Norman Cook, as he was then, became Fatboy Slim, the Frank Chickens, Billy Bragg, they were great nights. So in answer to your question, I was on the Red Wedge tour. Was you going to ask me something about it, Simon?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you'd had more than just a sort of passing acquaintance with it, and clearly you did. Did you feel on those nights of those tours that you were connecting with audiences, or were people just turning up to see rock stars play?
Yeah, well, the context of the time was, this isn't my theory, this is fact. Red Wedge was essentially a reaction towards the Thatcherism of that time. And therefore, when people did turn up, they weren't, in my opinion, they weren't turning up to see the bands and, I went to see Paul Weller last night. It was almost a personal statement by those people coming through the door. I'm coming here to watch what's going on, but part of my presence here is to say, I don't like Thatcherism. I don't like the way this country's going. Now, that's not a theory, Simon. That's a fact of the time. And the people who were part of the Red Wedge artists were of that persuasion too. Ironically, Paul Weller had started off as a Tory, and he had been, as you know, I was in this band with Bruce Fox and so on, all this. But yes. Paul used to champion the Tory party in the NME when the Jam first started off, but then quickly changed his opinion, and that's entirely up to him to do that as time progressed. And by the time of Red Wedge, he was almost walking around with a guilty conscience,
yes.
Shoulders hunched. And some of those gigs when he performed, he was tremendous at that time. He was just about to start the Style Council. So you heard some of the songs which were being played solo and acoustic by him. And they came across really, really well.
I mean, he was in some ways, I think Weller was at the height of his powers, but all of us in this virtual room, all of us are of a certain age, and Heath and I are a little bit older than you, Gary. But what do you think about the view today that as we've moved into a new century, has there been a disconnect between music and politics, or are there still people out there trying to make a difference through the music they make? Either Gary or Heath. What do you think, Gary?
Well, I think, I was pondering this the other day, and I think it's just the way that music has gone. There is so much more music available now through so many more platforms. The age of the 7-inch single has gone with streaming and SoundCloud. So you don't even have to be anywhere near a record deal to get music out there now. And there's so much more available. But what has happened right in the centre is that pop music, chart music, what sells, has become so homogenized that strands of like political music have just been pushed to the sidelines. So there's so much that there are probably far more political artists now making music than there were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But the way that the industry has changed, it means that those acts are so much more marginalised now. You take someone like Grace Petrie, who was absolutely fantastic. But a lot of people never ever hear of Grace Petrie. You've got to go looking for music now, haven't you, rather than it being given to you. And I think that's the big difference. I'm not being pessimistic. I can never see another Bob Dylan emerging. But that's just my thought. I don't know what you think, Heath.
I mean, that's amazing. That's the first time we've mentioned Bob Dylan, but let's hear what Heath has to say about that.
Well, I think an important thing in connection with the question that you've asked, Simon, is that I don't think you can make a living out of making music anymore.
Yes.
The period that you're talking about when you and I were young, you'd got the dole, and you could be on the dole and making great music and still eating daily. And I don't think anybody needs to have a conscience about that, because the people who were on the dole, let me give an example. The police were on the dole, but the money that they generated for this country as a result of their musical talent being developed over a long period of time, I'm telling you something you already know, was millions. Yeah. Now, let me tell you this. I live now in Harrogate, as you know, Simon, and a number of fairly young people, by fairly young people, I'm talking about anybody up to the age of 35, when I say to them, so what do you do? What do you do? Well, I've got my own studio. What? I've got my own studio in the garage. How have you got that? Well, friends. What I mean is, Daddy and Mummy got it me. Well, in my opinion, you don't make great music by Mummy and Daddy buying you a studio in the garage in your back garden. Yeah. It doesn't feel to be anymore that culture, what I used to call the dole culture of the 70s, where you had time to develop your talent and then market it to the world. And as you both know, as a result of that marketing of talent, this country became one of the dominant forces, musical forces on the planet. We must have generated trillions for this country. That's no exaggeration, is it?
No exaggeration. But is it possible today that the political issues have moved to a different place? Black artists, African-American artists, British black artists, they seem to be the ones pushing the political buttons. I mean, just in this last week, we've had this controversy about Wiley making anti-Semitic statements on social media. We even had Kanye West standing up and saying he's going to be the next president of the USA. Is this where the political drama is now being played out, do you think, Gary?
I suspect so, and I suspect politics in music goes where the big political concerns go, don't they? And I think the idea of capitalism now being so embedded in our world, and even as a lifelong socialist, I know I'm never going to overthrow capitalism. It exists. But I think for some more minority groups, their concerns are much more, the Black Lives Matter movement recently has highlighted this, that link between black music of a political nature and it actually being needed to be there because it absolutely impacts on people's day-to-day lives. So I can see, why music and politics has moved in that direction, and is being taken up by groups who need that politics in their music because their daily lives are absolutely impacted by it.
Absolutely. And Heath, just to think about another hat you wear, you present your poetry as a performance poet and so on. Have you come across any younger poets with a political voice in recent times? I know this is putting on the spot slightly, but have you come across any poets who are making political noises?
Direct answer is yes. And if I can regionalise that, let me tell you that particularly in Manchester and Liverpool, I've been fortunate enough to do readings in London where it just feels poetically, in terms of poetry readings, etc., it just seems to be much of the sameness all the time. I hope people don't feel patronised by this, but people wandering in and talking like this, man, reading poems. Well, that doesn't mean anything to me. Whereas the people in Manchester and Liverpool with whom I now work, and to be honest, and I mean this deadly seriously, in Pontefract too, at the Cat Club, some of the nights we've had at the Cat Club in Pontefract, when people turn up for the local area, Castleford, Normanton, these are people with a genuine voice, young people with a genuine voice, an original voice, and have really got something to say. Those are thrilling nights at the Cat Club. So in answer to your question, yeah, but it tends to be regionalised, Simon, in particular places, as ever, Manchester and Liverpool. You can always take it for granted that something's going to come out of there. But increasingly more, places like Pontefract, Castleford, and the great town of Barnsley too.
So, as we've already seen, our guest this week is Heath Common, a man who's written words in many forms, from journalism to poetry to songwriting, over a glorious career. And so now we're going to take a bit of time to speak to him about his career. So, Simon, I think you're going to kick off.
Yeah, sure. Well, you've hinted so far in the conversation that you've done all sorts of things which relate to the world of music and performance. But I mean, I've spoken to you over the years about the various encounters you've had with interesting artists. You mentioned Burroughs a little bit earlier on. I know you've got a good William Burroughs story, but tell us a little bit about some of your favourite encounters with musicians over the last few decades, because there have been many, haven't there?
Yeah, there have. I've been very, very fortunate. Complete nobody like me, just happening to bump into people rather than to be mixing in the same circles. But when I think of it, I'll tell you a favourite one of mine. I mean, one of my favourite songwriters, and I think one of yours too, if I might say so, Simon, is Ray Davies.
Oh, yes.
And a guy who was looking after my business at the time, a guy called Charlie Gillett, the late, great Charlie Gillett.
Of course.
He sent me off to a place called This in Norfolk to work with Ray Davies, a songwriting week, to come up with some new songs. I'll tell you who else was there. Was Kimberly Rue, who wrote Walking on Sunshine for Katrina and the Waves. But let me get to the point here. On the Friday night, after a long week, Ray Davies and I had been in the pub. And typical Friday night when you've had too much, not drunk, but, you know, you're very merry. We ended up in this barn at this place where we were in this. And Ray said to me, he said, what have you written recently that you're proud of? Those were his very words. I said, well, this, because I've been asked to write something for a TV series for Yorkshire TV. And I played him something. I said, what do you think to that? And he went, I thought, chuff, I thought you'd say more than that. I said, all right, what? Because to me, you see, Simon, he was just Ray. He'd been Ray who I'd gone down to the pub with. Am I making sense, not?
Yes.
Ray, like Simon or Gary, you know what I mean? I said, what are you written? I said, that you're proud of. And he played Waterloo Sunset.
Whoa.
I said, chuff it, neck. There's me there. What do you think of this then, hey? I thought, of course, this isn't Ray. This is Ray Davies, who wrote Waterloo Sunset, Days, all the classic songs. And if I conclude, I'll just tell you this. Ray invited Honor and myself to go and see the Kinks at Manchester Apollo. You know the Apollo, that great venue in Manchester. So we went along and got in on the guest list and all that stuff. And at the end of the concert, the Kinks had been brilliant that night. We're all filing out at Manchester Apollo. And then suddenly somebody said, they're back on, as we're exiting the theatre. So everybody about turned and went back in. And in a way, it was a bit dangerous because we're all, you know, like a Ellen Road, you know, when everybody goes back in a rush. And then you found a seat wherever you could sit down. And Ray walks up, he says, he was by himself with his guitar. He said, I'm sorry about this. He says, I've forgotten about this. He said, I intended to do it. He says, this is about a night in Dis in Norfolk, and it's for Bill and Honor. You know, Bill's my real name. He says, it's for Bill and Honor, and he started playing Waterloo Sunset. God, it was just a magical moment. So he's saying, tell me about the favourite time you met somebody famous. That's definitely one of them, mate. Ray Davies.
And I know that you and I have got an interest in the American beat writers.
Definitely.
You told me a tale once about how were you in Holland and supporting William Burroughs or something? What was all that about?
That was with Ick. That was just Trevor and I in Ick. And we performed at the Paradiso, this club in Amsterdam, with Burroughs, and he was reading. There was a few, you know, as part of the, what did they call that tour? The Atrocity Exhibition tour.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And anyway, after the performances, he was interviewed in the dressing room, and he was talking about this great single that he'd heard by Ick, that's us. I Ick, I Try, but he said, I like what those guys are doing, you know. And the following morning, Simon, I mean, again, totally deflated I was here. We were in the lobby of the hotel where we were all staying, and I went up, typical sycophant. I said, Mr. Burroughs, you know, I mean, one has to show due respect. I said, Mr. Burroughs, I said, that was wonderful of you to say on radio last night, how much do you like what Trevor and I are doing and how much you like our single? He said, I didn't say anything. I said, I thought it was a joke, you know. I said, you did, you know what you said? He said, I have no recollection at all. And it wasn't being nasty. That was, as you know, that was Burroughs. You know, don't get above, I mean, this was the implication. Don't get above yourself, mate. You know, don't think you're the new I am. He just said, I don't remember saying that at all. Totally deflated, Simon, totally deflated.
In terms of, you know, I said earlier, you know, you've written in many forms. In terms of sort of poetry and lyric writing, I mean, I think all three of us have written lyrics and have written poetry in our time.
Everybody.
How do you see it, Heath? Do you see a disconnection between poetry and lyrics? I mean, do you write something and you know that's going to become a song, and something you know it's going to be a poem, or you know what? How do you see both those sides of writing?
Well, in answer to that, Gary, I'd go back to Mark E. Smith, you know, he once said to me that the fall had started off because when he was younger, this is pre-fall days, he used to get ideas in his head. I mean, he used to take LSD a lot, did Mark, in his early youth. And these words would come to him, or these images would come to him, and he'd write them down in exercise books. And that developed into him putting songs together and thinking about the idea of performing, which is how the fall came together. And the reason I'm telling you that brief anecdote is because I don't think there's any difference between lyrics and poetry. I think what does happen is there's a process where something puts ideas in an individual's head. And sometimes, not always, sometimes an individual feels the need to get the words out of himself or herself onto paper. And then once it's on paper, this is how things were with me, you know, as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old kid. Once they're on paper, if you have access to an instrument, like I had a guitar, or you have an instrument or something which can accompany those words, then the whole idea of performance starts to occur to you, doesn't it? I mean, I'm 65 now, and I'm being serious, and I'm still performing because there's still a culture where I'm able to do that. You know, I mean, a lot of people retire, as you know, and then have nothing for the rest of their lives. I'm so flipping fortunate that I'm able to continue doing something which gives me a sense of fulfillment. And I know the same is true for Simon. I don't pretend to know you at all, Gary, but I hope it will be true for you when you become an old man.
and have you ever had a preference in terms of performing poetry or performing with bands? I mean, have you just enjoyed all aspects of performance, or have some things stood out more to you than others?
I've enjoyed everything. I don't make any distinction at all. I mean, I've had a magical life. That's a considered statement. I'm astonished at how magic my life has been because, you see, I've kept a foot in both camps. I've been in what we might term the straight world. I'm sure the three of us understand what I mean by that. I mean, to become a head teacher, you've got to be pretty respectable. And I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of it. But then at the same time, I've also kept a very firm foot, the other foot, in let's call it the bohemian camp, you know, songwriting, performing, all those different areas you've just identified. And then I've married those together. No, let me say they have been married together you know, almost organically. And that, I think, is what's afforded me such a magical time. It's been brilliant. And Leeds have been promoted as well.
Could I just ask you about this interesting relationship with Marquis Smith? Because Smith is sometimes seen as a highly literate, sort of radical wordsmith. He's sometimes compared to Joyce and to Burroughs, for example. Was the Marquis Smith you knew, was he a reader, was he literate, or was he embarrassed by these sort of comparisons?
Well, he was literate and he was a reader. He was a furious reader. Let me just say that if Mark was still alive and you said, so do you know Heath Common, Bill Byford? Do you know? He'd say, never heard of him, you know. And if you then explained, come on, you do know him, he'd say, absolute prat. So let's get that down on record, you know, that he hated somebody like me rattling on about him. But I will say, yeah, H.P. Lovecraft and Raymond Chandler, he was a huge fan of both of those. Big Burroughs fan, as you know, and he was a very literate person.
And when I mentioned that we were going to have this three-way, this menage a trois on Zoom, Gary said to me that he was very fond, and this is a completely different topic now, he's very fond of the Rhythm Sisters in the 1980s, these two amazing young women who fronted the band that you were very much part of. How did that Rhythm Sisters thing happen in the later 1980s?
Sure. Trevor and I, this bloke, Trevor Dollive, we were recording at Abbey Mills on Kirkstall Road in Leeds. And the guy who owned the studio said, oh, I've got these girls coming in, the Mice. And they were Debbie and Mandy Leake. And they were in the studio next door. And to cut a long story short, they ended up singing backing vocals on this song that I'd written. And at the time, well, I still have a very deep interest in Andy Warhol. And I was always fascinated how Andy Warhol created these so-called, what he termed, superstars. These people who came out of nothing, and he redefined them as superstars. And because I was a young bloke then, in my juvenile way and childish way, I thought, I think I'm going to try it with these two. I think I'm going to create two superstars. So I wrote all the songs for them, managed them, and, you know, they ended up on Top of the Pops, Friday Night Live, a 5-page feature in the Sunday Times. I could bore you all day with what happened, but I was thrilled that I'd managed to create Warhol-like superstars.
Because I absolutely loved the Rhythm Sisters when they first came out, and I bought the records and everything, and it did seem at one point that they were going to go on and become really big stars out of Leeds, and then it just seemed to go and evaporate and disappear. What kind of happened from your point of view? Why did it all kind of fall apart so quickly?
Well, basically, I'll tell you what happened was the cartel, what was called the cartel, you know, Rough Trade and all the independent, it collapsed. So that we were on Red Rhino, and Red Rhino, as a record label, Tony Kaye's record label, collapsed. And we'd had such a good working relationship with Tony because, I mean this seriously, Gary, he was just like you and Simon are. I could talk to him. We were the same social and political persuasion. Everything worked. And once the cartel collapsed and the majors came sniffing round, because, I mean, I was a teacher. That's what I was doing. The Rhythm Sisters was effectively a hobby. It was an expense, as I've just said. Let's create Warhol superstars and all that facetious nonsense. And when the majors came in and started talking big money, as they did, then, as always, things started to fall apart. Now, hold on. You're saying that you wrote all the stuff, but we want to be writing some stuff now because that's where the money is in publishing. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Effectively, I got bored with something which was essentially a hobby. And I'm being serious now, Gary. It's like you're supporting Leeds United and Leeds being relegated. You know that feeling, a pit in your stomach. I don't like this anymore. this isn't what I came into this for. And it just collapsed and fell apart. I don't know what they're doing now. I haven't seen them for 30 plus years.
I know you used to write for Melody Maker and others. How do you feel about the state of the music press now? It left a great imprint in all our lives. Do you feel as if it's a dead beast in the water?
Yeah, the medium is definitely, because the internet's taken over, for want of a better definition. So it's gone. I mean, I remember in the late 60s, early 70s, my life revolved around the day that Melody Maker and NME came out every week. It defined excitement. It was almost like football on a Saturday. NME and Melody Maker being published on a Thursday was up there with that. But as I've just said to Gary about different acts, everything has its time. And the print music industry has had its time.
Yes.
And something will come in to replace it. What it is, I don't know. My sister, Jill, she runs this thing with John Robb, this guy from Manchester, called Louder Than Words, this festival. And Simon's been with me sometimes. In fact, Simon used to be part of Louder Than Words. And when you're there, this weekend festival, which is an annual event, you can feel again the excitement of print. Would you agree with that, Simon?
I would. I mean, I think there is still a constituency of a certain age, people over the age of 40 or 45, who still hunger for writing about rock music, about rock culture. They want to buy magazines, they want to buy the books. And Louder Than Words is about rock writing. And you're right. If you're in a certain age bracket, there is still that hunger to devour the word on the page. I don't think people under 40 are going to ever catch up with the sort of phenomenon that is or was. I think it is a slightly historic thing, but Louder Than Words is keeping the flame burning for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's see what comes next via the younger generation and what they generate. I don't throw in the gauntlet down there as a challenge. I'm just fascinated as to what inevitably the social culture of adolescence will generate next. It's a fascinating thought.
So in part 3 of our show, we always ask our guests, and this week it's Heath Common, we always ask our guests to bring a piece of music to the table that they'd like to discuss and talk about. And Heath, you'd like to talk about an amazing song that's had such a wonderful history, Mac the Knife. So tell us why you decided to bring that to the table.
Yeah, I've decided to choose that, Gary, because at the moment, as you know, I'm involved in the writing of this musical about Keir Hardie, along with my mate, John Hardy. And when you asked me to choose something for this programme, I thought, right, Mac the Knife is perfect to sit alongside what we're doing with the Keir Hardie musical. Brecht and Weil are two of my favourite creators. I'll call them no more than that, because Brecht's not a songwriter, but he's very much a political thinker, as Kurt Weill is as well. And I chose a song as a result of its similarity to what I'm doing professionally at the moment with the musical.
So it's been a big inspiration then in terms of your writing in this form. That's been a big inspiration, has it, throughout the opera?
Politically, yeah. Not the song style, but what Brecht and Kurt Weill did in terms of political nous and their conception of how they might change society. I mean, if you see the film of Threepenny Opera, it's a wonderful scene when the people gather around, the crowd gather around, and they're inspired, because what hooks them, and this is sometimes an important verb to use in terms of politics, you can pontificate all day long about politics, and sometimes, if you listen to people talking endlessly about politics, it turns everybody off. I mean, Brexit's a perfect example of that. But if you are communicating a political message via the medium of a song hook, and Mac the Knife is one of the great hooks of all time, isn't it? Then you can convince your audience very quickly. For want of a better cliche, Gary, Simon, you are sweetening the pill with a hook. And both Brecht and Weil were superb at doing that.
But it was a fascinating song because in the late 1920s, opera version was first performed in Berlin. I think it was in the German Mac Die Nesse, wasn't it? Something very close to that. And it was a sinister, dark song about a gangster operating in the underworld. Yet by the time Bobby Darin was singing it, some 40 years later, and turning it into a kind of show-stopping pop song, it's amazing, isn't it, how a song can have different lives and different versions.
Absolutely. I mean, at the time that Bobby Darin was singing that, and it was very much a populist song, it was also the time of McCarthy and the McCarthy witch trials, which makes it a supreme irony. I'll just say something about the McCarthy witch trials, in that they were seeking in the States to label anybody from the entertainment industry who might have any remote communist leanings. And through that movement, anti-communist movement, Bobby Darin emerges with what is essentially a communist song. It becomes a populist number. I mean, it could have easily featured on the Val Doonican show. Gary, the Val Doonican show was a song, show in the 60s on BBC television.
Oh, I remember it in the 70s.
You communist.
Yeah. But it is, and Sam is right, it's interesting that a song that comes from such an overtly political work can have a life that's totally external, and particularly by the time you get somebody like Frank Sinatra covering it as well, who you think possibly didn't buy into that politics of where it came from. But a great song can exist in its own right, can't it, in that way?
Yeah, because of, I'll use these words again, because of the hook communicating all the time. It's a wonderful thing if you can create hooks of that nature. I mean, the other person who could do that was Burt Bacharach. I mean, I'm not pretending Burt Bacharach was in any way political, but by goodness me, he and Hal David had this unbelievable ability to capture the Western world public. Let me generalize as much as that, with hooks. You imagine if Bacharach and David had been political entities, goodness me, we might have had a much more different world, mightn't we?
Well, let's turn finally then to a song that you've written recently as part of this work that you're doing about Keir Hardie, and a song that you want to talk about, the Miners' Dance. Can you tell us a little bit about that song in particular and about the wider piece that it's going to fit into?
Yeah, let me say immediately, the song is written by John Hardie and myself. So it's very much John Hardie and me, Heath Common. Let me think. Well, I'll tell you what I'll say. I'm the first generation, me and my brother, Mark, were the first generation not to go down the mine, right? And that's a massive thing to us. I'm from Normanton. And when you speak to people in Normanton or any other mining community, I used to be a deputy head in Barnsley, at that school where the film Cares, but that's another story. But you talk to people at Barnsley about their time down the mines. These were hideous, hideous times. So the Miners' song is about Keir Hardie being a miner, but it's also about how he was seeking to bring great light to the people who, this sounds very cliche, but who worked in great darkness 24/7.
Now this piece that you and John have written, and one thing I did want to ask you, is John any relative of Keir Hardie? Because he shares his name, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's a direct descendant.
He's a direct. I didn't realise that until I've confirmed that with you now. So he's a descendant of the Hardie family.
Yes, indeed.
And he with you has written this wonderfully exuberant piece, which you might tell us a little bit more about in terms of the recording. But one thing I noticed on the recording, your voice appears in there, and you tell the performers or the dancers to go to the right or go to the left. And would you be embarrassed if I said to you, it reminded me a little bit of Malcolm McLaren in Buffalo Girls?
That's brilliant. I love that. I love Buffalo Girls. But ironically, I mean, he's coming out of the boroughs of New York there with these proclamations, as you know. But I was thinking more of the Morris dancers.
Right.
And the Morris dancers moving to the right, moving to the left. But I'll tell you what I was thinking of in particular, Simon. And again, I emphasize I'm being serious. I was thinking, hopefully, with any musical, you hit right across the age groups. And although this song might hopefully work with young people of my daughter's age, I wonder if it might also work at a family wedding. You know, when everybody's had a few too many drinks and something comes on and everybody gets up on the dance floor. Well, if move to the right, move to the left can become a cliche where Granny says while shaking a leg, move to the right, move to the left. Am I making sense?
It's that hook again, isn't it? You were talking about earlier. It's that hook.
That's exactly it, Gary. Yeah. Let's hook in it. That's what musicals are all about in terms of marketing, as you know, lads.
In terms of that, Heath, what? I mean, I know we're in a very difficult time at the moment in terms of theatres being closed and all that kind of thing. What's the projected idea of how you're going to move forward with this musical?
Right. Well, if you'd have asked me that on January the 1st of this year, I'd have had an informed answer about a great plan and how it was going to be marketed at the Edinburgh Festival and subsequently at in the West End, hopefully. You know, I'd have had a considered answer. But now, in 7 months, things have changed totally. So now by we I mean me and John Hardy and the lady who wrote the play, Helen Shea, she's a great playwright, we're thinking about what we're terming guerrilla performances, turning up at places, providing that it's safe to do so. I'm being serious. In other words, social distancing and everything, and staging performances in places where normally performances would not be taking place. And if we can reintroduce the concept of theatre into people's lives, not through theatres, but through spaces which are redefined as performance places, then that will do us. Because basically, it's a political play with a political message. And as I keep saying, I keep repeating this phrase, the more people we can hit with that political message, i.e. Keir Hardie stood for this, don't you think there are elements of his life that we might all admire? The more we can share that with people and champion it in what will now be exceptional circumstances, the better.
From the merry month of May, dancing round the gardens on a golden summer's day. Everybody's happy, dancing with a smile, bells and boots together in the Grand Morris style.
Move to the left. Yeah, move to the right.
Now the winter's
So just to round off, say thank you, then, Heath. I mean, what's been fascinating about this chat today that we've had is, and we've counted this on in a number of our interviews, me and Simon, you know, it's this interconnectedness between, you know, like I know you and Simon have worked together, me and Simon have worked together. I've never met you before, but I think we've found lots of different connections that we've all had today, and I think that's what's been so fascinating about doing these interviews. It's finding people who you know, we have these connections with. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing about your musical and writing past, and I wish you every success with the Keir Harvey musical going forward in safer and better times. And I'd just like to say thank you, Heath Common, for sharing your time with us today.
You're a great man, Gary, and Simon is too, but I must leave you with this thought. Another connection between the three of us is that you and I are big Leeds supporters, and unfortunately, let's face it, let's put the cards on the table, Mr. Warner is Man U.
We'll have you next season, we'll have you.